Good evening. I'm Roy Larick of Bluestone Conservation. Thank you, Bob Garden, for organizing Big Creek Monday Meetup 2024. Thank you, Sarah Corrigan, for hosting the event. Great to see the room filled with Watershed volunteers. Bluestone specializes in restoring the most compromised urban streams on Cleveland's east side. In all watershed work, conserving and replanting the urban forest is imperative. Currently, there is a new interest in trees. Money is available to plant. We must plant intelligently. Tonight's topic is replanting the Cuyahoga County urban forest naturally, that is, following historical nature. The premise is that when we give historical nature the lead, we can plant a better future nature. In localizing the topic to western Cuyahoga County, I'll go back 8 years to October 2018 in this same room. Bob Garden had organized the first Big Creek Monday Meetup. My task was to show the emergence of Big Creek as the last Ice Age glacier retreated northward about 14,000 years ago. Here is a slide from 2018 with the Big Creek watershed outlined in white. We think of Lake Erie as Cleveland's primary landscape feature, but it is really the Portage Escarpment that cradles the Lake Erie Central Basin to its north. The escarpment has distinct highlands east and west of the Cuyahoga Valley. Note that the highlands have unique positions on the escarpment. On the east, the lake sits closer to this feature. The land rises quickly, some 700 feet from the lake to the eastern highland. The steep rise close to the lake makes for a significant east side snowbelt. Later, we will see that the local forest transformed sharply in these conditions. On the west, with the escarpment farther south and less steep, snowbelt conditions are diminished. In the middle ground, which holds Big Creek, green on the map, the landscape has subtle topographic and hydrological features. We will see that the native forest has diversified quite differently on this western middle ground. But let's get back to the issue of how to restore urban forests naturally. I suggest that in replanting trees, we must make use of an intermediary concept called ecological infrastructure. With ecological infrastructure, we rebuild urban service delivery around multifaceted ecological function. Planting trees as ecological infrastructure, for example, serves to infiltrate stormwater using fewer pipes and create wildlife habitat. In this way, ecological infrastructure makes for a more natural urban environment. In planting trees to create ecological infrastructure, a primary issue is species diversity. How do we keep the urban forest ecologically adaptable, geographically diverse, and climate resilient? Most tree planting projects follow local diversity planting guides, such as the 10-20-30% rule. That is, plant no more than 10% from a single species, no more than 20% from a single genus, and no more than 30% from a single family. Sounds good at first glance, but the reality is that we all draw from the same rather small set of tree types, a couple score of species that are deemed proper for Ohio and are available in local nurseries. Let's map the general effect that local diversity rules have on a regional nature that is patchy north to south and east to west. If, following the 10-20-30 rule in Escarpment Euclid and Highland Brecksville gives similar results, are we nature-based? Are we increasing diversity? Similarly, if the replenished upland ravine forest of Chagrin Falls begins to look like that of Lake Plain Bay Village, are we diversifying canopy? The answer is no. In sum, local diversity rules are blind to the regional context of the locale. They are not really nature-based, and for all good intentions, may even decrease regional forest diversity. Let's see how the historical forests of Cuyahoga County were, and still are, geographically diverse. Geographic diversity is a product of a regional ecological system, centuries in development. Maintaining the larger system diversity is important for forest and community health. Therefore, countywide, historical species diversity should be a guide for county urban forestry. So let's go to the historical forests in two data sets. The first is the Moses Cleaveland trees. And this is living trees that represent the forest of 250 years ago. And the second is the Connecticut Land Company timber rankings, which were records made more than 200 years ago about the trees that actually stood on the landscape. Let's look at each individually. The Moses Cleaveland trees played out in two chapters, maybe three. First, in 1946, it was Arthur B. Williams of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History who came up with the idea for identifying trees that stood in the forest as substantial trees when Moses Cleaveland arrived in 1796. And in that time, 150 trees were meant to be designated, one for each year of Cleveland's existence. After 1946, the project was forgotten until 1970, when the Early Settlers Association of the Western Reserve picked it back up and began 16 years of study and more designations of Moses Cleaveland trees. In the end, we have quite an interesting database here. 153 trees of 23 species from 1946, an inventory in 1971 by the early settlers, which went to all 153 sites and found 92 trees still standing, and then designations from 1971 to 1986 for a total of 143 new trees, but of just 7 species. The intent was different. And in 2021, several of us did an inventory of all 296 sites. We found 77 trees still standing, but the point is we have the data for which prehistoric trees were growing in which places on 296 sites. And the results are quite interesting. Most of the trees designated were oaks, and the oaks tend to grow for a long time. They don't succumb to accidents very often, and they are charismatic in the landscape. They look good when they're old. So 186 of those 296 Moses Cleaveland trees were oaks of various types. Here in this pie chart, the yellow indicates white oak, Quercus alba, black indicates black oak, red oak, and on. So everything is an oak between 12 o'clock on this pie chart and about 7 o'clock. And the other species of designated trees then came in quite smaller proportions than oaks, generally speaking. And you can see the percentage representations. If we map this out, it starts to become interesting. The yellow place marks indicate white oak, and most common species designated, certainly, but a concentration on the west side. And why should this be? Well, there are kind of political reasons about the designation of Moses Cleaveland trees that play in here. But looking at this map, one gets the impression that there are more older white oaks and other kinds of oaks on the west side than there are on the east side. We'll take this up later. The second data set is the Connecticut Land Company timber rankings, which were done from 1796 to 1806. And I have the frontispiece from the Euclid notebook from June of 1797, when Charles Parker and Joseph Landon led a group of surveyors to cut 250 miles of survey lines across Euclid Township, an amazing feat at the time. And these notebooks, there are notebooks for every township in the Western Reserve, and it is Katie Flinn, plant ecologist at Baldwin-Wallace, that with her students has studied all of these notebooks, conserved in the Western Reserve Historical Society, to put on paper the timber rankings from all the notebooks. And some are more complete than others. So you can see on the map that Brooklyn Township has dense representation: Euclid Township, Warrensville, Northfield, and Bedford Township, Brecksville as well. Okay, the others have these timber rankings just from the borderlines of the township, but they can be dealt with very well, and Katie has done that. Putting all this data together and using some modeling, some sophisticated modeling, Katie and others have come up with a map of the forest of Cuyahoga County in 1800. And I want you to look at the colors and the variation in the colors, the patterns that you see. So let's start with the east side, where things are more clear. We have Lake Plain forests, and that Euclid data makes for the yellow up there. Don't know what's going on exactly, but there is a transition from the lake shore across the Lake Plain that is oak and some maple and ash and elm, and then things change to more oak as the escarpment rises from Euclid Avenue, and by the time you get into the heights proper on top of the Brea sandstone, that beech maple forest, the dark blue, has taken over with just slight variations in some of the larger ravines. You see to the east, the Chagrin Valley looks nothing like that plateau forest. It's much more highly charged with oaks and maples. Similar for the Cuyahoga Valley on the west side. And then let's go to the decently far west side, the area of Big Creek, and you see it's a muddle. It kind of looks like scrambled eggs to me in terms of diversity. The environmental or the substrate factors are not as greatly defined on the west, but there is something going on with the forest that has allowed it to diversify with all species, you might say in all places, but still there is a subtle pattern that is landscape-based, what's going on. And in the upper reaches of the Big Tree watershed, we get the transition on the west side to the beech maple forest. And I'll add another chart of Katie Flynn's here. Unfortunately, the color scheme does not match. But in 1800, by far, the most prominent tree was beech, or Ficus grandifolia. Almost 50% of all trees recorded in those survey notebooks was beech, American beech. And the next largest group was that 12 or so species of quercus, or oak, that dominate in the places that aren't dominated by beech and maple. And then the other species are much less frequent. So Acer, or maple, is the next largest, and it's much less than about 15%. Castanea, which is chestnut, no longer in our forest, was a significant tree at the time, and Fraxinus ash, and the other is the other. Okay, so there are about 40 species represented here, but the major ones stick out, and they define the forest by environmental substrate. Now, if we put all this together, we can come up with a characterization of the prehistoric forest, the native forest, or the historical forest of Cuyahoga County at about 1800. And I've tried to match the color of the script here with Katie Flynn's map. So the blue relates to those beech maple areas that are high and humid. And it turns out that this is our less diverse forest. It covers the largest area, but is highly dependent on those two genera, beech, single species, and maple, just a few species. Hemlock, one species, and there are variants of this forest, beech maple, hemlock beech. They are strong forests, but they are not as diverse as you might think. And then if we go to the slopes, the flanks, the Portage Escarpment facing north, the flanks of the Cuyahoga, Chagrin, and Rocky Rivers valleys, those slopes are a little drier, and the oaks come into their domain there. So we have oak hickory forest, chestnut oak forest, oak savanna forest. These are more diverse. And then, not very well represented on the map, is the lowland forests. And those lowlands are either on the lake plain or lowlands high in that plateau, in the Appalachian Plateau. And they are quite diverse, with various kinds of oaks in pin oak flats, and as if you know the floodplains in the Metroparks, lots of sycamores and black walnuts, other wet-loving trees, a great diversity of trees on these lower areas, floodplains and lake plains. Now, this is a lot of information to put on a map, and I can't quite do it on this, so I'm going to use this map to transform to a profile way of looking at geographic diversity and the forests that developed on them. But let's look at this map for a few minutes. What stands out beyond the colors related to elevation from blue near the lake to the kind of brownish in the highlands is this series of brightly colored lines drawn across, which are the old fossil beaches of former stages of Lake Erie. And the highest one is Maumee at 1790 is the very thin line on the west side to 760 feet above sea level, the prominent yellow line, Lake Maumee, the earliest Great Lake in our area, and then a drop to 730 feet for Lake Whittlesea, 680 for Lake Warren, 640 for Lake Lundy. There are others, but these are the major ones. And I include these because for a look at the regional forest, these beach ridges being well drained were quite different. They had a different assemblage of plants, including trees and especially oaks. Now, to try to actually place trees on these, I want to make two profiles, one on the east side, represented by the line over the eastern highland, and one on the west side by the white line that runs from the lake to the western highland. And we'll be looking east at these profiles as they play out here. So on top we have the eastern profile, bottom is western, and I've put the Big Creek Watershed in, highlighted it on the lower one there. So you see that they both go from the lake at 570 feet to about the same height, 1250 feet, the highest point on the east side, 1280 feet on the west side. But they're structured differently. That eastern highland, once again, comes closer to the lake. And so you have the beach ridges from these old lakes kind of piled on top of each other just at the base of the Portage Escarpment at Euclid Avenue. And then we have some deep ravines, Euclid Creek on the east side, and then Tinker's Creek, which makes for the southern boundary of this eastern highland. And up above, we have two rock units that structure this eastern highland. And we have a similar thing at the base, but the Euclid bluestone is not at all prominent on the west side, so things look a bit different. It's a long slope up to the highest area. The beach ridges are spread out, so these unique environmental zones, ribbons, are scattered across the landscape or stretched across the landscape. Now, let's try to put the trees on top of this, and we'll strain a little to do this. Those beach ridges are defined by black oaks as the major tree. And because they are dry, well drained, they aren't as heavily forested, so we get then savanna-type forests in the beach ridges. And that they're the same beach ridges, east and west, but they make more of an impact on the west side because they're spread out. Let's go back up on the top to the east side. That steep rise to above Euclid Avenue to the top of the first step of the escarpment gives us a chestnut oak forest. And I'll show you a chestnut oak tree in a little bit, that these trees coming from Appalachia have a way of digging themselves into the caprock of the east side escarpment that lets them survive where other trees can't. And then as we head up, we get to BM, the beech maple complex, and upland swamp complexes, which again are quite diverse with trees that love water. And then at the very top, on the Sharon ledges that we all know, Kendall's ledges, Thompson's, all of them, these have a range of forests from hemlock and maple, beech and maple, and upland swamp forests, some very interesting trees in those upper areas. And then the backside, upland swamp to beech maple, and then in the Tinkers Creek Valley, an oak hickory forest that faces south. And, you know, we have more northerly exposures, Portage Escarpment, on the south shore of Lake Erie. Our southern exposures are less, but when they're there, it's the oaks and the hickories that make for the forest. Okay, coming down to the west side, you see that the oaks have a greater presence. This is recorded in those survey notebooks. This was recorded by Arthur Williams, the kind of dean of forest ecologists in our area, as he talked with the old descendants of the early settlers when he was working in 1930. Those descendants of the early settlers who knew where the stands of trees were. All right, so this is my attempt to put together the trees with the substrate on the east side and the west side. It's a work in progress. After having you sit through all of that, let's have some fun and look at the oaks as a group of their own. And have a few shots here from Doug Tallamy's The Nature of Oaks. I think most people here know Doug Tallamy, a great advocate of backyard nature, including planting oaks. Oaks are great trees because they harbor so much life. Now, I've talked about white oak. Here's a beautiful white oak in South Euclid, Green Road and Mayfield, essentially. And the white oaks especially have that gene, like the southern live oaks, to spread. So given the chance, a white oak will spread, and it's probably the most beautiful tree in our region. Tends to grow in the uplands, tends to grow on escarpment slopes. Doesn't have to be a steep slope. You see this is nearly flat here, but the tree of the uplands, oak of the uplands. And in the wet areas, a different kind of oak takes over, the red oak, and as you can see, the roots are well adapted to holding on to a sloped area here. So the humid equivalent of a dry-loving white oak. And then we have two lake plain or other wetland oaks. On the upper left is the swamp white oak. This is a Moses Cleaveland tree in Euclid, a beautiful tree. It's got to be 250 years old. It spreads forever as well. And then a pin oak, which should look a bit like the swamp white. It is on the red oak side of things, and it's been butchered by pruning for utility lines in Rocky River. Okay, I mentioned chestnut oak. On the east side of Cleveland, all of the gorges that we know, that's Doan Brook, Dugway Brook, and 9 Mile Creek and Euclid Creek, and there are other smaller ones, at the lips of the ravines or gorges where the bedrock outcrops. You see the Cleveland Shale here on the left-hand side. Every tree that you see on this upland is a chestnut oak, identifiable by the very coarse bark. You see how these two trees, especially this one in the foreground, is clinging to that rock, putting its roots right in the fissures between the beds to bring the water to the tree even when it's dry out. And you see Euclid Creek 120 feet below there on the right-hand side. So this is the case on all of these streams. Once again, Euclid Creek, 9 Mile Creek, the Dugways, and Doan Brook all have these chestnut oaks clinging to the rocks. And then the last one I'll bring up is the black oak. And for this, I go to the Lake Warren Beach Ridge complex in the Toledo Metroparks, which the reservation is called Oak Openings. And you can see the sand of the old beach ridge still undeveloped. This Lake Warren Ridge, like the others, runs across our region, and if we didn't have the development in Cleveland, you would see scenes of this type here. So the big trees in the background and the smaller ones in the front are black oaks. The flowers are lupines. There's a whole savanna complex of very interesting plants that are typical of these beach ridges. And to kind of prove the point, this is just behind the Art Museum. It's a fantastic tree that's not long for this world. It's a Moses Cleaveland Tree black oak that is just behind the entrance to the Brower Wing. And the rise that you see there is artificial, but Wade Oval gets its name because it encircles an old dune of this Lake Warren Beach Ridge complex. Okay? And wherever you go on Wade Oval, you'll see black oaks. And some of them are Moses Cleaveland trees of this type, but others have just grown in the kind of unkempt areas that typified University Circle, Wade Oval, 100 years ago. This is no longer happening. There are no longer black oaks seeding themselves, but they want to grow in this dune, in this beach ridge environment here. And we should make more of this. Now, in bringing this all back home, how can we use what I've just been through to follow historical nature in order to plant a better future? I'll end with one proposition, and that is, let's dump that 10-20-30 rule for a number of others, and I'll bring up one, which is the 330-300 rule for equitable nature access. And it gets us to another way of looking at trees in terms of what is best for not only the forest, but for the humans who live here, many of whom are in environmentally underserved neighborhoods. And the 330-300 rule would say that Cuyahoga County residents should see 3 trees from their dwelling, have 30% tree canopy in their neighborhood, and live within 300 meters of a high-quality green space. Okay, well, 3 trees from a dwelling, that can be any 3 trees, but when we get to the 30% tree canopy in the neighborhood and the high-quality green space in patches around the county, this is where we can start to rebuild the forest as high-quality green space according to these historical patterns that, once again, were thousands of years in development. The species are well adapted to these areas, and they continue to want to grow here. This is where we can encourage a replanting of the historical species that make sense for these areas. Thank you, and we'll turn to questions.